Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Before I start, let me just say that this place is a really special place for my wife and I, actually. 3.5 years ago, I asked her to marry me on that beach. Yeah, and she said yes, yeah. And we spent our first anniversary at this hotel. And actually, we got invited back to this conference, and she is 7.5 months pregnant. She's 7.5. Hello? Can you hear me? All right.
Which one is she?
She's right there in the black. Yeah. So we're hoping she doesn't go into labor and make this a really special experience. So let me start. Have you ever had a dream that you wanted more than anything because you believed that when you got there, when you finally attained what it was you were looking for, that everything would be okay? I did. Oh, did that work? There it is. I saw my dream the first time I walked onto a Wall Street trading floor. I was 22 years old, a junior at Columbia on the first day of my summer internship, and in a single instant, all my vague sort of ambitions about being rich and successful suddenly coalesced into a single vision: becoming a successful Wall Street trader. Credit Suisse First Boston was the place. It was on 23rd and Park. It was one of the most prestigious investment banks in the world. And I remember that first day, the elevator opening on the 4th floor to reveal a room the size of an airplane hangar. If this clicker would work, you'll see it. Around the perimeter were glass-walled offices, and in the center were row after row after row of trading desks. There were glowing flat-screen TVs on each wall, each column, and each trader sat in front of 6 to 8 computer monitors and a phone turret that made it look like the cockpit of a fighter jet. But the energy was quiet and intense, nothing like the screaming you see on the TV. This was what Wall Street really looked like. And what really got to me was the people. At a glance, you could see by their starched monogrammed shirts. There it is. That's not me. That's not me. That's what I saw. I'd never seen actually two-tone shirts, blue and then white. And what I also saw was these caramel golf tans, you know, and Italian loafers with no socks. And I saw in an instant that these were people that could spend $1,000 without ever thinking twice about it, that had lived a completely different life than the life I grew up with. I grew up middle class. Both my mom and my dad were always freaked out about money, both because they didn't make that much, but also because they weren't very good at budgeting or paying bills on time. My dad in particular was twisted when it came to money. He loathed spending money. He would take us all out to dinner, but he would insist that everybody order the cheapest thing on the menu. And no drinks, no drinks. I have an identical twin brother who you can see here. And when we got old enough to drive, my dad insisted that we share a driver's license. so that he would only have to pay for one insurance, for real. Later, my twin brother got a DUI on my license, so for years that was a big problem between us. But there was another reason, and so I learned from an early age never to ask my dad for money. That was a bad idea. But there was another reason that my dad was, sorry if I'm going to walk in front of this, I just don't want to stay on one side of the stage. So, my dad would, there was another reason that he was tortured about money, and that's because he believed that how much money you made was how successful you were in life. He didn't like, there we go, as a low-level salesman, He didn't like the story that his life was telling. We had moved out to Los Angeles to be, so that he could be a screenwriter, but that didn't work out, and so he got a series of dead-end jobs, and he was really tortured by his own failure. And he would always talk about this future that he would either sell a script or start a business and sell it and make $1 million. And on that day, everything would be okay. He was always talking about it. But I didn't care if my dad was successful or not. I was a kid, so he was my hero. He was this big guy, you saw him, he had a big white beard, he was like 250 pounds. Huge guy to me. But the thing about my dad was he could be so silly that he'd do these like little dances. And just when he would do it, I would laugh so hard that I couldn't breathe. My twin brother and I would fight like dogs to see who could sit next to him in the car. But there was a side of my dad that wasn't so great. The tiniest misstep could set him off. Say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, and his face would turn purple. And his lips would start to shake. And when that happened, watch out. Anything could happen. Sometimes walking through my house was like navigating a minefield. From a very early age, the most important thing in my life was impressing my dad. He'd ask me how my day was, and I'd play up my successes, which were usually academic, sometimes athletic, and I would keep secret my failures, which were pretty much always social. I had a real knack for making enemies, and as somebody mentioned, the cheerleaders I liked didn't like me back. So there was always this big gulf between sort of the life that I wanted and the life that I actually had. And it was really important to me because I always told my dad about my awesome life.
Is that you?
No. That's the me I told my dad about, and this was the more... that was the reality. I was always trying to bridge that gap between those two lives. And so I always employed these different strategies like piercing my ear, wearing a chain wallet. In high school, I'd bleach my hair. But none of those ever worked. And I was always sort of on the perimeter looking in at that cool group. There was one thing that helped bridge the gap between the person I wanted to be and the person that I actually was, and that was drinking. When I would drink, when I would have a few beers, I would become expansive and tell jokes and flirt with girls, and people seemed to like me. My dad seemed to like me, actually. Senior year in high school, we started drinking together, and he'd take me out to a restaurant and buy me a few drinks, and we'd sit there and talk intimately. I'd tell him about what a stud I was at school. He'd tell me about his future success. The day I got into Columbia was the proudest day of my life. For one, my dad was thrilled. He called everybody he knew to tell them that his son was an Ivy Leaguer. But for two, it was the first time that I'd really differentiated myself from my dad, because by that point, I had become terrified that I was going to end up like him, tortured by my own failure, jealous of other people. I thought Columbia was this first step, but actually it turned out to be a disaster. I sort of showed up to college woefully unprepared for college life, started drinking every day, turned into drugs really quickly. There was nothing I wouldn't do to impress people at bars or at parties. A year and a half after I got there, after I'd already been arrested twice, I was finally suspended from college for burglarizing another student's dorm room, a prank I'd cooked up in order to impress some guys on the wrestling team, which I'd already been cut from. I hadn't told my dad any of this, and so the day I called him was one of the worst days of my life. He was silent for a long time, and then he started screaming at me. And I, to deflect the verbal blows, I kind of hunched over the phone and just sat there and listened as he called me a stupid, stupid idiot. The next few years were sort of a blur. I spent 6 months in New York working for an internet company, then moved to San Francisco, got a job at another internet company, started doing progressively harder and harder drugs, ended up getting fired from that internet company for fist fighting in the office, which is not a good idea, it turns out. I moved back to New York, re-enrolled at Columbia, swore off drugs, but not alcohol. And then a miracle happened. And I met a girl. She was a starter on the Columbia volleyball team. She was gorgeous, incredibly popular, way out of my league, and she liked me. And so we started dating, and I fell for her really hard. So much so that a few months into us dating, when she told me that my drinking was a problem, I tried to quit, and I went through a few bouts of sobriety with a few bouts of backsliding. We moved to Los Angeles a few summers later for the summer, and my drinking got out of hand, and this time she insisted we go to couples counseling. I was, I think, 21 at the time, so couples counseling wasn't my idea of a good time. But I went a few times until I stopped it and said that this is just way too lame for me to do. So we went back to New York, and I started applying for internships and lied on my resume, omitted all the things that I had done wrong, and ended up getting that CSFB internship. And at that point, I felt like I was the luckiest guy in the world because despite all the problems that I'd had, all the trouble that I'd gotten into, I had this prestigious internship. I was re-enrolled at Columbia, on track to graduate, and I had this perfect 10 girlfriend. I was, however, not the perfect 10 boyfriend. I still drank a lot. And sometimes when I got drunk, I'd end up with other women. I also didn't treat her well in terms of calling her back, being a present boyfriend. So that first week of that summer internship, I didn't call her back at all. She would call me on the phone, but I was too focused on work. The second week, I didn't call her back either, but I noticed that she had stopped calling. And the third week, she sent me a text that said, "We need to talk." And so she came over one night, and I was on my bed, and she was in the doorway of my bedroom, and she told me that she was through. And she said, "I don't like who you've become." And I remember I was hit with this wave of pain that was so strong that I'd never felt anything like it before, and I couldn't breathe. And she started to back out of the room, and I tried to grab her because I figured if I could just hold her still for a second, I could explain, apologize, this whole thing would go away. But she was gone. I heard her go up the stairs, out the front door, and I sat there on my bed just reeling. But I only sat there for a few seconds because I realized I had to get her back. So I jumped up, ran out the door onto the street, but she was gone. There was a cab turning around the corner, which she no doubt had gotten into. So I went back inside my apartment and I sat down on the couch. I crumpled onto the couch, it's more like it. And I'd never experienced that sort of pain before. It felt like an organ had burst and toxins had spread through my body. And, you know, it was like I'd expected the sort of push-pull of a dysfunctional relationship, her to tell me to stop seeing other women or that she wanted to see other guys, and there was nothing incremental in her actions. I still admire the finality of those words. I'm through. I don't like who you've become. And so I sat there on that couch, smoking cigarettes, listening to a Bruce Springsteen album on repeat. And when I wasn't smoking, I would literally wrap my arms around myself and just rock back and forth. And I stayed that way all night. I smoked 2 packs of cigarettes. In the morning, I was dizzy. I knew I had to go to work, but I couldn't go to work. I was in too much pain, and so instead I went and I sat outside her apartment, and I waited for her. And eventually she came out, and I stood up and I yelled out her name, and she looked shocked and then scared. And I started towards her, and she said, "No!" And so I stopped, and a cab pulled between us. She opened the door and said, "Go to work, Sam." And then she got in the car and left. And I was alone again. And so when I got home to my apartment, I sat on the couch and lit a cigarette. And you know, for so long I had numbed myself with drugs and women, and I actually had some pot in my pocket, but I had never felt so unhinged before, so I didn't know what would happen if I smoked it, so I didn't. And you know, all my life I'd had all these setbacks, all these, getting kicked out of school, etc., and I always managed to rebound, but this time I felt spectacularly defeated and completely alone. And what that felt like to me, being completely alone, was like standing on the edge of a cliff overlooking an abyss, just this darkness. And I didn't know what would happen if I was going to fall in. But I didn't want to fall in. I mean, it was a terrifying abyss. And so I did something that I wouldn't have ordinarily done. I picked up the phone and I called that couples counselor. And I said, "This is what happened. Will you help me?" And she said, "Yes." Her name was Linda. She was about 6 feet tall, blonde hair, very high cheekbones that she said reflected her Cherokee heritage. She wore these long, flowy clothes that to me looked really out there. Even worse, she wasn't a psychiatrist, she wasn't a psychologist, she called herself a spiritual teacher. Said that her teachings were based on Native American belief systems. She would use these words like spiritual malady and inner wound and honor and integrity that to me sounded completely corny. If I had known another spiritual counselor, I would have called her. But I didn't. So I called Linda. So I started talking to her on the phone. She was in Santa Monica, I was in LA. Under her guidance, I gave up drinking and drugs, went back to work. And on the trading floor, I was a completely different person. Before, I had been so ambitious, and now I was ambitious, but I also felt like my chest had been split open. And my heart was just thumping there. I was raw, and I felt like I was going to burst into tears all the time, and I'd sneak off the trading floor to go smoke cigarettes and come back and wash my hands and face so nobody would smell it, but I'm sure they knew. A few weeks later, my dad came into town on a business trip and asked me to meet him for drinks. And I said, "No, Dad, I'll meet you for dinner, but I'm 3 weeks sober. I'm not drinking, and I'd actually appreciate if you don't drink." And he said, "Okay." And so when I showed up to that restaurant, it was an outdoor table. He had a table next to the sidewalk, and next to his water glass was a fresh Manhattan. And I looked at it, and I sort of crumpled into my chair across from him, and I just said, "Dad." And he looked at me, and he looked at the drink, and he said, "It's just one." And then seeing my still contorted face, he picked it up and drained it. And then looked at me, and his look said, "Problem solved." And his disregard for that request that I had made just, at first I was hurt, and then suddenly I was furious. And I stood up from the table, and I pushed the chair back, and I just looked at him for a second. And then I didn't say anything, I just walked away. And I heard him yell after me, but I kept walking. That summer ended. I didn't get offered a full-time job at CSFB. So I went back to Columbia for my last year, spent the whole year trying to get a job on a trading floor. It was 2002, after WorldCom, after the dot-com crash. Hard to get a job on Wall Street. I couldn't until finally a managing director at Bank of America in Charlotte agreed to take a chance on a kid who had called him every day straight for 3 weeks. So I moved down to Charlotte, North Carolina. By the time I got there, I was a year sober. I was still shaky, but my ambition had returned. I was determined to be a trader. And it usually takes on Wall Street about 3 or 4 years to become a trader. You spend your first years fetching coffee or making copies. But I was determined to do it faster, and so I worked 12 to 14-hour days. It was the first one in, last one to leave. On the weekends, I'd work both days on the weekends. But when I came home from all that work, click, I would do the work that Linda told me, that Linda talked about. So I would write in a journal, I would start to meditate, I would read these spiritual books that she recommended. It's true, I didn't have a lot of friends in Charlotte, so that was my two things. And the thing was that over the last year, the spiritual work I had started to do with Linda had started to become really important to me. I was sort of aware that I had this cavernous hole inside me, and I was still afraid of it, to be honest, but I also wanted to get to the bottom of it. And we'd spend time on the phone talking about my turbulent childhood. And sometimes I'd go out to Los Angeles, and when we did, I'd do these guided meditations with her, so I'd actually be in her office. I'd be sitting across from her. I'd have my eyes closed, and I'd be talking about what it felt like to be teased as an overweight kid. And I would just be glad that the door was locked because of how ridiculous and exposed I felt. And sometimes those meditations would end or would lead to memories of my dad and his rage, and tears would pour down my face. And then when they were done, she would bring me out and I would open my eyes and she'd have this big smile on her face and she'd say something like, "A trauma has been released." Which to me sounded incredibly corny, but also felt sort of true. So I was sort of living this double life. I had my spiritual life and my Wall Street life, and I knew it wasn't a good idea for them to mix because on Wall Street the mantra is we work hard, but we play harder, which pretty much means hard drinking. I thought it probably wasn't a good idea to tell the traders about my sobriety or my twice-a-week Native American spiritual teacher. About a few months after I started, this trader who was 4 years older than me was hired away. I was at Bank of America. CSFB came and hired him away for $900,000. And it was the first time I saw what Wall Street money really looked like. And it jacked my ambition into overdrive. And it especially jacked my fear of letting other people know that I was sober and talking to a spiritual counselor. I knew that I had to impress the other traders, but mostly I had to impress my boss, Michael. And given his reputation, I knew that was going to be difficult because Michael was not only a legendary bond trader, he was also a legendary partier. He was at the bars every night, cocktail always in hand. He epitomized, we work hard, but we play harder. In fact, he touted it. He would talk about how his success was completely predicated on the network he had built in boozy late nights at bars and strip clubs. I was terrified about what would happen when he found out and when the other traders found out that I didn't drink. But for the first time in my life, at 23 years old, I felt this sort of core of strength inside me that said, I'm going to do what's right for me no matter what these guys think. One night, all the traders and I were out at a bar. Michael was not there. I was sitting at one end of the bar sipping my club soda. This Midwestern frat boy, the senior trader named JJ, who always made me get him coffee and always made me make copies for him and tortured me pretty much, came up to the other end of the bar and he shouted across and said, "Sam, I'm buying drinks for everybody. What can I get you?" And there was nothing for me to say except Diet Coke. And he said, "What? I can't hear you." And it was one of those moments where the whole bar went silent. And I overcompensated and shouted, "Diet Coke!" And he looked at me and he got this look of disgust on his face and he said, "What, are you pregnant?" He said, "Let me get you a real drink." And I shook my head and for the 4th or 5th time said, "Diet Coke." And so he shook his head and he ordered, and a few minutes later the drinks came up to the bar and I walked up to the bar to get the drinks with everybody else, but before I could, JJ grabbed me by the shoulders and he said, "Do you not drink alcohol?" And I said, "No, I don't," and walked away. The next day on the trading floor, that's the trading floor of Charlotte, North Carolina, Bank of America, the news spread like wildfire. At one point I saw trader lean over and say to Michael, whisper something in his ear, and Michael stood up, and he was a few rows away, and he shouted across the trading floor, "Sam, is this true? Do you not drink?"
Oh my God.
And I just stood there. It was like the script of my life playing out over and over again, my inability to fit into a crowd. And I didn't know what to say. I knew Michael was just going to say something to humiliate me. So I just stood there, and the silence stretched. And then he got this look in his eye, and he motioned me over towards him. And so I walked down the row towards him, my heart kind of thumping. Oops, sorry. My heart sort of thumping in my chest. And when I got to him, I squatted down really close. I hoped that by being close to him, he would speak softer. And so I squatted down next to him, and he looked at me pretty intensely for a few seconds. Then he said, "Sam, is there a reason that you don't drink that you don't want to talk about?" And I looked at him and I said, "Yes." And he looked at me for a second, and then he sort of nodded, and then he turned away to his computer screens. And I don't know why, but that was the moment that he took me under his wing. And so from then on, he started asking me to walk for coffee with him, just the two of us. Whenever he needed to go to the airport, he'd ask me to drive him. And none of the traders ever said anything else. He must have said something to them. But nobody said anything about my not drinking. One day, I was driving him to the airport, and he looked over at me and he said, "Sam, how are you doing with money?" Now that was a loaded question for me on several levels. For one, money was tight. I was in my first year of Wall Street, which was a good salary, but I hadn't got a bonus yet, and I was paying off a twice-a-week counselor and my school loans, and also I wasn't very good at budgeting, so it just felt like water was draining out of my checking account. Also, I was on Wall Street, and people were getting these huge bonuses, and so I was so jealous of everybody else and all their money that I really wanted to get a big bonus, and I knew that Michael controlled those purse strings, but I also knew that it was very dangerous to ask men for money. And so I said, trying to sort of thread the needle, "I'm doing okay. Things are a little bit tough because of my school loans, but I'm managing." And he looked at me and he said, "Do your parents help you out?" And I said, "No." And my chest puffed up a little bit because I learned as a kid not to ask for money, and now it was sort of a point of pride for me. And he opened the center console of his car, and he pulled out stacks of $100 bills. And he pushed them towards me. He said, "Here, take it." And as soon as he offered it to me, I knew that I couldn't take it, that I was okay with money. And I said, "No, thank you," but I was touched by his generosity. But what he said next changed my life. I'm going to have trouble making it through that part. He said, "Sammy?" He had started to call me Sammy by then. He was the only person who ever called me that, and he still does. And he said, "Sammy, if you ever need money, like $100,000, all you have to do is ask. I trust you." $100,000. I trust you. Instantly, I was flooded with memories of my dad sighing when I'd ask him for lunch money, or the barrage of questions I'd get when I asked him for something, so that by the time he pulled out his checkbook, I didn't want what I'd asked for. I realized in that moment that my dad treated me like I was a burden. I was a burden to my dad. I waited until Michael was out of the car before I started crying. That moment changed everything for me. That Michael trusted me, valued me, made me feel trustworthy, valuable. I started walking with my head held higher. A few months later, he made me a junior trader, just 8 months after I'd started on Wall Street. My bonus that year was $40,000, and I was psyched. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to check my bank account before I pulled out my ATM card. But at the same time, I was dissatisfied because I'd learned that being a bond trader in Charlotte is sort of the low end of the Wall Street hierarchy, and that the real money was being a CDS trader, a credit derivatives trader in New York. So I petitioned Michael to let me move up to New York, and after a few months, he allowed me to do that. And pretty soon I was a CDS trader in New York, and I made $75,000 my second year, and $125,000 my third, and then $500,000. And pretty soon I was a Wall Street trader, a successful Wall Street trader with a lifestyle to match. I had a $6,000 a month loft apartment on Bond Street in New York. I had a closet full of Barney's shirts and $500 Prada loafers. I would take my then blonde girlfriend out to expensive restaurants and on Caribbean vacations. And I felt so important. Oops. Whenever I'd fly into town on a business trip, there would be a black Lincoln Town Car waiting for me with my name on it. I could go to any restaurant in Manhattan just by calling a broker who ingratiate themselves with traders with their unlimited expense accounts. And I loved how these guys would pull out their credit cards for me. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the power. Because of how smart and successful I was, it was these guys' job to make me happy. But at the same time, I'd be on the trading floor, and maybe I'd make $500,000 that year, and the guy next to me would make $3 million, and I would be racked with jealousy, especially if somebody was my age or younger. It would eat me up inside. About 3.5 years after I started on Wall Street, Citibank came in and offered me a 1.75 by 2, which means $1.75 million per year for 2 years, guaranteed. And all of a sudden, the money opened up for me, and I was thrilled, but I turned the offer down. Because by that point, I had set my sights on something bigger. I used that job offer to secure an internal promotion to the distressed trading desk at Bank of America. Distressed traders are sort of the high end of the Wall Street hierarchy, sort of the most elite group on a trading floor, sort of like the Navy SEALs of Wall Street. And it's distressed traders that are the most likely to become billionaire hedge fund managers, and that's now what I wanted to become. When I told Linda about my plans to become a billionaire hedge fund manager, she wasn't exactly thrilled. She said, sometimes fantasies come from a wound. She said, sometimes people that feel powerless as children try to compensate as adults by making money, securing power, earning prestige. But sometimes what they really need is not to accumulate more money, but to heal their inner wound. And when she said that, I was just like, oh my God, inner wound? Still? I was 5 years sober. I had been in counseling that long. I had processed all the pain about my dad. I had repaired the damage I had done when I was drinking. And now I wanted to be successful. What was wrong with that? A few months later, one of the top hedge funds in the world came in and offered me a contract, and all of a sudden I found myself in the inner sanctum of Wall Street, which was literally working elbow to elbow with billionaires. And for all of my life, the word billionaire had just been a word, a sort of out-of-reach concept, but now I saw for the first time what it really looked like. And what it really looked like was estates in the Hamptons, private jets. It looked like senators stopping by their apartment. Their office. It looked like every single room they walked into, they became the center of. And that's not even considering the money. It was crazy to actually think about how much money they made. They made hundreds of millions of dollars each year. It was like every year they won the Mega Millions lottery. And then the next year, they won it again and again. But the thing about that hedge fund was that it took me a year to get settled, but then once I did, I found myself in a position that I hadn't been before. I was sort of at the place I wanted to be. The guy ahead of me was 10 years my senior. He was the head of trading. He was a 100 millionaire. 10 years ahead of him were the 2 billionaires I worked for. And so for the first time, there wasn't like an immediate promotion that I was looking for. And that pause, and the work I did with Linda, started to bubble up in me, and I started to sort of see things that I hadn't seen before. The first thing that happened was I was in a club with a bunch of other traders and our girlfriends, and it was like loud club, you know, fancy club, music thumping, lights flashing, beautiful people all around. I was sipping my club soda, bottles of Cristal were coming out, and there was this trader, this big guy who was a former football player, and he was dancing. He was wasted, and he was dancing like a gorilla. He was like, ugh. And he kept saying something over and over. He would go, and I wanted to know what he was saying, so I walked over to him. And I heard what he was saying, and he was saying 35 sticks. 35 sticks. Now on Wall Street, a stick is slang for $1 million. And so he was saying that he'd generated $35 million in profit that year. And what that meant to me was that he was going to get paid way more than I was that year. And I got hit with this wave of jealousy. And all of a sudden I was just soaked in it. I was just soaked in jealousy. And I comforted myself and I said, well, he may make more than me this year, but I'm going to make more in the long run. 2 hours later, I was sitting by myself. I had wanted to go home an hour ago, but my girlfriend was drunk and dancing and wanted to stay, and I was irritable and tired, and sitting there sipping my club soda, and all of a sudden this thought that had been on the perimeter of my consciousness suddenly stepped into the light, and it said, my life always looks like I've always wanted it to look, so why am I not happy? Why do I feel so empty? Why do I feel so jealous? I thought about that moment that I had walked onto the CSFB trading floor years before and saw in that single instant everything fused together to see my vision of what I wanted to be, a successful Wall Street trader, and now here I was, a successful Wall Street trader. I had more money in the bank than my dad ever had. I was more successful than he had ever been. But I still felt exactly like he felt. Like I wasn't successful enough. Like I didn't have enough money. And then I took another look around the club and I realized how absurd it was that I was even here. I'd been sober for 5 years. I hated clubs. I didn't like being around drunk people. I liked nights at home reading. What was I doing here? And that's when it occurred to me that maybe it hadn't even been my dream. Maybe it was my dad's dream. Our culture's dream. Maybe that's why I felt so empty. So I made a few changes. I moved out of that $6,000 a month loft apartment into a $2,700 a month one-bedroom in the East Village. I stopped going out at night with other traders and came home and would talk to my family on the phone and do spiritual work, writing in my journal, meditating. And that allowed me to start seeing some things differently as well. One day I was in a meeting with my billionaire boss, one of my billionaire bosses, and several other traders, and it was during the crash of '08, and we were talking about the new hedge fund regulations being proposed by Congress, and everybody in the room was against them, and I said, well, isn't it better for the system as a whole? And my boss got this disgusted look on his face, leaned over just like that guy was, and he said, I don't have the brain capacity to think about the system as a whole. I can only think about what's good for us and our business. And I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach because this guy was one of the smartest guys I'd ever known. And he had more money than almost anybody in the world. And yet all he could think about was what was good for himself. Yeah, I judged him. But I also judged myself because I saw myself in him. I saw that we were all millionaires and billionaires during the worst financial crisis that most of us had ever seen, a financial crisis that our industry had in fact caused, and all we were focused on was what was good for us and ourselves. And I thought about my girlfriend, and I thought about her saying, I don't like who you've become. And she was right then, and she was still right. And for the first time, I felt embarrassed about my career. I'd been reading Taylor Branch's series on the civil rights movement, and the image of the Freedom Riders, sorry I'm in the way, I know, the image of the Freedom Riders stepping off of that bus in the Deep South into an infuriated mob had seared itself into my mind. And I'd been reading, I was probably high on coffee, and I was like, if I was alive in the 60s, I would have been on that bus. But sitting in that room with my billionaire boss, I just knew that I'd been lying to myself. There were countless injustices in the world. Right now, a sexual assault epidemic, swelling prison populations, the obesity crisis, the financial crisis that we had in fact caused. And instead of doing anything about those, I was actually profiting from them. That year was actually the best trading year of my life. I had shorted the derivatives of risky companies, and I made a boatload of money. As the world crumpled, my portfolio turned green. I realized at that moment that if I had been alive in the 60s, I wouldn't have been on that bus. I would have been in a Manhattan skyscraper making bets on which companies would benefit from the civil rights movement. Companies like hospitals. A few nights later, I went to dinner with my other billionaire boss. It was an internal staff dinner, and the reason was so that this billionaire boss could tell us his wisdom about certain industries. And you'll forgive me if I disparage him a little, but he was not a well-liked guy, and everybody sort of talked about how this was not beneficial except for his ego. But here we all were at this dinner, about 6 traders and him, and here we were sitting and listening raptly to him as he talked, and he'd focus on one person at a time, and I'd let my eyes roam, and I'd catch the eye of another trader, and they would catch my eye and hold it for a second too long, as if to say, how ridiculous is this? And again, I thought back to Taylor Branch. Sorry, that's out of, well, whatever. That's us kissing his ring. And I thought about Taylor Branch and Martin Luther King, and I thought about how Martin Luther King never had any money. He never had an official position. Everything that he had came from inside him. And this billionaire boss was totally the opposite. He had money and position and power, and that's why we were all there, even though we actually didn't really like him. Didn't respect him. And it wasn't that I had this big epiphany that Martin Luther King is somehow more morally righteous than a billionaire hedge fund manager, because I knew that. But I realized for the first time that I had spent my life trying to become that billionaire hedge fund manager. And all of a sudden my heroes changed. And that was the moment that I thought about leaving Wall Street for the first time. I realized that I wanted a life where my insides match my outsides, where instead of spending my life accumulating money, I could actually try to make a real contribution to the world. But that meant leaving Wall Street, and here's where we get to the absurd part of the story, because I was terrified because I only had $1 million in the bank. And I was scared about running out of money. But even more, I was scared about being adrift in the world. You see, for so long, I had drawn my sense of value from the institutions that I was associated with. My business card. The lessons my dad beat into me, he beat in there pretty deeply. And those lessons about the power of organizations and being associated with them is so seductive to me. My last year on Wall Street, my bonus was $3.6 million, and I was pissed that it wasn't bigger. I had made a lot of money, so I had all these rationalizations about why it should be bigger, but the truth was I was really afraid. I was afraid of what would happen when I left, because I knew that I had to forfeit half of whatever bonus I got if I left. That was just part of the deal. So I argued for my bosses to up my bonus to $8 million, and they said they would up it if I agreed to stay for several more years. And I was tortured with conflict. Because I knew the guy that I wanted to be was not this guy, but on the other hand, it seemed crazy to walk away from all this money, not just the $8 million, but the every year bonus that I could see stretching out for 20 years. Serious, serious money. I had put myself in this position, and just to walk away from it seemed like a complete waste. Fortunately, even though my mind was deep in conflict, my body was unequivocal. I had gotten sick 14 times that year. By the time I came in for my last day, the thought of staying even another week filled me with so much dread that there was nothing else I could do except leave. And so I left. And that's what I looked like for 3 years. Because I'd wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat from a nightmare in which I'd lost all my money. Or I would read in the papers about a peer of mine that had been named to a senior position, and I'd be devastated for days. But I learned to soothe myself and repeat this thing that I had come to believe, that value doesn't depend on how much money you have in the bank. And try to remember that I had enough money. And that's really hard for me. Brené Brown, a PhD researcher on shame, talks about how we live in a culture of scarcity. How in the richest nation in the world, most of us believe that there will never be enough, especially for us. That is true for me. That was true for me. On some days it's still true. I believe that I grew up in this house and that my dad's rage, but also his fear about the future, left me seeing the world as this terrifying place. And I spent all my energy trying to make enough money, power, prestige, to wrap myself in a warm blanket of safety. But that's not really living. That's hiding. And worse, it's ineffective. Because no matter how much money I made, I was still afraid. No matter how much money I made, I was still jealous of other people. I believe it was the work I did with Linda, the processing of the pain from my childhood, the step-by-step, brick-by-brick building up an internal sense of self-worth that allowed me to start trusting myself and trusting the world. And once I began to see the world as a safer place, I began to dismantle the mask that I had spent my life constructing. And even better, I started liking what was underneath. But I'm not fixed. These cultural beliefs run deep inside me. It is hard to let go of hierarchical thinking, of the belief that Jamie Dimon is somehow more valuable than the homeless guy on the street, or the belief that the rich and famous are somehow more important than the rest of us, or that an ordinary life is a wasted life. I've heard that my whole life, and it's hard to let go. In the years after I left Wall Street, I started doing volunteer work and writing, and nobody seemed interested in my story of personal transformation, and the ones that were wanted me to write a sexier tell-all book about Wall Street instead of the book I wanted to write, which is about a spiritual awakening on Wall Street. And when those, vulture hawk thoughts that had circled my head for years would come back and say, you're a failure, you're not enough, you're not important unless you're famous, you're not important unless you have millions of dollars coming in the door, I would do what I learned to do, which is close my eyes and repeat my mantra, I am enough. My life is enough. And to be honest, I'm still embarrassed kind of saying that because the abundance of my life, without any of the other stuff, just my wife, my daughter, soon-to-be daughter, all the love in my life, all the money in my bank, it's amazing what I cannot be grateful for. And then, in January of this year, the New York Times emailed me to say that they were going to publish a story or an op-ed that I had submitted to their general email address. I didn't know until the day before they published it that it was going to come out on the front page of the Sunday Review. And my life sort of exploded. As you might imagine, publicity is seductive to me. Recognition feels good, much like heroin, And I've worked really hard during these past few weeks to stay grounded, talk to my counselor, meditate, stay close to the people who've been there the whole time. But it's hard. My cousin asked me the other day how I was staying grounded, and I started to tell her, and then I said, you know what, I don't know. Every time I've been not grounded, I've thought I was grounded until a year later when I realized I wasn't grounded. So I don't know if I'm grounded right now. I'll close with this. Alice Miller, one of the people that Linda pushed me to read, said that, I'm going to have trouble making it through this one too, that the difference between an abused child who ends up repeating that abuse and one who ends up living a productive life is the presence of something she calls enlightened witnesses, which can be anybody, a teacher, a coach, a therapist, a neighbor, anybody who pays attention to that kid and in so doing lets them know that they're valuable. I believe she's right. I believe that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Linda and Michael. Linda's here today. Better yet, I'm going to have a picture soon, but her and Michael are now friends. Can you imagine that, a bond trader and a Cherokee spiritual teacher? But that's what I needed, you know. And it's because of them that I know how single moments of generosity, of kindness, of love can reverberate through an entire lifetime. And it's because of them that I work hard to remember that the way I treat the person standing in front of me, whether it's my wife, my brother, my employee, a stranger, can have a profound impact on their entire life and on mine. Thank you very much. Dad, and I didn't know whether that question would come up, but it's important to me. I haven't talked to my dad much for about 8 years. Somebody said yesterday that it's really important to reconcile with your parents, and I respect that opinion. And I also have my own. And I have come to understand that my dad is being in a relationship with my dad is sort of like being in a relationship with a steak knife. The closer you get to him, the more you get hurt. And I was thinking about this last night. I was thinking about this idea of reconciling with your parents, and I was thinking about, you know, the whole spectrum of it. What if you're a woman who's been raped by your dad repeatedly, and now you're an adult, and your dad hasn't acknowledged that, he hasn't made any changes himself? Is it really a good idea to reconcile with him? I don't think so. I'm not there. I'm on a sort of smaller end of that spectrum. But I do think that one thing is important, which is that when I think about my relationship with my dad, I cannot think about that relationship with him unless I think about my relationship with my daughter. Because I believe that we live in a world where violence is passed down through generations. And how it's passed down is, my belief is that we pass down stuff. We take the anger that has been given to us and we pass it to the least powerful people in our lives, and those are usually our children. And so it takes a tremendous amount of courage to stand up and turn towards the parent who is always powerful to that child, no matter how old they get, and say, no, no more. And that's what I did with my dad, and it's hard. It's hard every single day. And I'll tell you one other thing. We live in a world that always says things like this. It says, you need to reconcile with your parents. It's better. You need to do that. Forgive your parents. Forgive your parents. I do forgive my dad. But I just want you to all know how hard it is to hear that all the time when you don't know who my dad is, and I don't know who your dad is.
Sam, I don't know how old your father is, but I'm 72 years old. And you have told my story, almost verbatim. And I never had the courage that you have displayed. And I just want to thank you because this conversation has changed my life.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Do you have any suggestions or feedback from those of us who are doing our own version of Cherokee spiritual work in terms of getting it out into the kind of environments that you were working in?
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, he said, do you have any suggestions for us who are trying to get sort of Cherokee or Native American belief systems out into the greater world? I don't know. I mean, people ask me, am I expecting to change Wall Street? And no is the short answer, you know. Like, I know that when I changed, it was like the 1,000th time I'd heard the same thing, and it was only on the 1,000th time instead of the 999th that it actually meant anything to me. And so that's what my hope is, that I can be one voice saying one story, and maybe it'll hit somebody on the 1,000th time. I also do think, and this is the truth, and I actually argue with Linda quite a bit about this, because to her, language is really important. And she's right, she's 100% right, and the language she uses is so pure. But I also figure my job is also to translate it as much as I can into language that messed up people like me can understand. So it's a difficult high wire act because I don't want to lose the meaning of her language, but I also want other people to be able to hear it. Oh.
I'm inspired at how at such an early age you have managed to transform your life into a story of your contribution, making your life a story of who you really are, what your life is really about in this world, how you can make that story one of contribution for everyone. And so this would be a good time if you're willing to do so to talk about grocery ships, how that happened, and what's going on with that.
So Grocery Ships is actually it's a program of personal transformation. I didn't realize that until this weekend when I heard some of the speakers. But it's a program for low-income families that are struggling with obesity. And it's not because low-income people are the only ones struggling with obesity. I think I personally have struggled with that my whole life. But we go in and they apply, and the name is like Scholarships for Groceries. So people apply, they get a scholarship, and that means that for 6 months we support them in whatever way we can. So we give them money to buy healthy groceries. We provide a curriculum of education, but even more importantly, there's a support group element to it. And I don't mean support group like we're teaching them stuff. We just simply provide a space and a circle of support for these families to work on this really, really difficult issue that is unfortunately a societal issue created by our culture and something that is not sort of people's fault, so to speak, but at the same time, we're all affected by it. And these people are, all of us, are suffering from it. Diabetes, blood pressure, but also just the emotional shame and self-hatred that comes part and parcel with being a person in this world, frankly, and body images and celebrity culture and fast food and all this stuff. And so we just provide a program for people to hopefully make some improvement towards a healthier life.
Wow. Yeah.
Any last question?
What's your belief about money now?
It's a tough one. I don't know that I'd figured it out, you know. I think that money can be a good thing and it's an important part of a life. I think it's hard to think about money without thinking about fear and expectation, and it's so fraught that it's hard to like get a objective view on it. I'm glad I have money. Linda tells me all the time, I still get scared about money, if you can believe it. And she says, money's not going to be your problem, it's going to be okay. And it's really hard for me to sort of accept that. So I know it has a lot to do with fear. Oh, I'm sorry, behind?
So I've noticed the theme of jealousy that's come up a lot, envious of people
Yeah.
that are more than you, and all that sort of stuff. Because the culture that we live in defines our success by what we've achieved and how much money we have in the bank and all that. So what is your greatest tool to dealing with that tendency for you to be jealous when other people have more money?
I mean, literally, it's the stuff I do. Like, I literally, like, most nights I go to sleep, and before I do, I close my eyes, and I say, I am enough. My life is enough. And my wife makes me do a gratitude journal every night. And I never like it, but I always do it, and it always feels good afterwards. But it's hard. I mean, this is the thing, is like, I don't have a great answer, and I don't want you to think at all that I'm zen with this stuff, It is like, it is so deep in me and so deep in our culture. It's hard.
Yeah, well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you for just your gift of your vulnerability, your honesty, your transparency. I mean, it's truly, what a gift. What a gift you have given me, given us. And if it means anything, just bless you and your wife and your daughter, your family, and everybody that has been part of your journey. Just thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.